Here we are. Um, Acknowledging that we reside in the homelands of Indigenous peoples is an important step in recognizing the history and the original stewards of these lands. Land acknowledgements must extend far beyond words. The United States has worked hard to erase the narratives of Indigenous peoples over time. Land acknowledgement statements can help remind us of the history, the contributions, and the sacrifices Native peoples have made. We honor and acknowledge that we are on the ancestral territories and homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. This area, specifically the confluence of the Platte and Cherry Creek rivers, was the epicenter for trade, information sharing, planning for the future, community, family, and ally building, as well as conducting healing ceremonies for over 45 indigenous nations, including the Lakota, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, Paiute, Zuni, Hopi, among others. We must recognize Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land, and as these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, remember the ties these nations still have to their traditional homelands. Let us acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory and pay our respect to the diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. Let us also give thanks to all the tribal nations and ancestors of this place. This land acknowledgement was provided by Gracie Redshirt Tyon, who is the Director of American Indian Student Services. I also wanted to acknowledge that the Auraria campus, the creation of the Auraria campus displaced an entire community. So I wanted to acknowledge that as well. Um, I'd like to go over a few guidelines for our discussion tonight. The first is I will lean into conversations. I will believe everyone is doing their best. I will critique ideas, not people. I will use I statements. I will accept a lack of closure. I will not make assumptions about other people's identities. I will take care of myself and take breaks if I need to. I will agree that what is shared here stays here and what is learned here leaves here. Now, I'll also put these in the chat. And if you have any questions during our programming tonight, you're welcome to chat them to me privately and I can bring them up for our speakers later. Thank you for giving me the space, and I'll pass it over to Natalia.
Hello, my name is Natalia Walton. I am the Graduate Assistant Coordinator for the Center for Identity and Inclusion, as well as the Interim Graduate Assistant Coordinator for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I am excited to have everyone here. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Myself being a woman of color that wants to get into academia and, of course, become a leadership in academia. So tonight, unfortunately, we lost one of our panelists and they were unable to attend. So we have some free time that we wanted to offer some learning for our participants and ourselves. I have created a Kahoots. It will be centered around women of color in academia. So if you can, give me just a second to get set up with that.
While we're getting this pulled up, you should probably bring up kahoot.it so that you're ready for the game code.
Absolutely. Is that not allowing me to do that? Exit.
Oh, you go back to it, you should be able to press play, and that'll bring up the code and everything.
Okay. We will be offering a $25 e-gift certificate to Amazon this evening to the winner. So if you want to put in the code, if you are unable to go to Cahoots, if you can play along in the chat, hopefully Miss Aja will be able to monitor the chat as well. I always love the names that people come up with for themselves if they don't use their own. I think the last time I played, I was Empress or the best. Yeah, the best. I didn't win, but yeah. Let us know if you're having issues logging on or if you're going to participate via chat. Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and get started. So the first question is, how many women of color work at MSU Denver? There are several options here: 78%, 13%, 100%, or 21%. You're also timed on your how fast you get it in there. That gives you a couple of points also. So the correct answer is 21%. Awesome. So we have 3 in the lead. That's wonderful. What percentage of women of color individuals are on the tenure track at CU Denver? Is it 24%, 55%, 13%, or 2%? The correct answer is 24%. This one is a little misleading because we also included male identifying individuals of color. Jess, awesome. What percentage of faculty at CU Denver are on the tenure track and identify as female? 56%, 4%, 13%, or 39%? It is actually 39%, and we also included Caucasian identifying individuals. Holding on to that lead there, Jess. True or false? Only 5% of American college students are African American. True or false? The answer is true. What is the name of the women of color that founded and started Cookman University? Alice Palmer, Britney Spears, Mary McLeod Button, or Camilla Harris? I was trying to throw everyone off with that one. Guess I didn't. Awesome. What year was all of Auraria campus institutions ran by women? Was that 2020, 1999, 1832, or 2021? There are two correct answers for this. All institutions that include CCD, CU Denver, MSU. So MSU's chancellor started in 2020, which made that answer correct. And our own chancellor at CU Denver started at the end of 2020, but all of them ran in 2021. True or false? Women of color have an easier access to tenure track because of affirmative action. True or false? Awesome. No one got that one wrong. So Jess, you, oh, Zip. Awesome. If you can privately chat me your email address, I will get your $25 Amazon gift card over to you. Um, I hope everyone enjoyed that. That was fun for me. I learned a lot of facts while I was actually creating it. I did not know that all of Auraria was ran by women. That was astonishing to me. And uh, I was blown away, right? But without further ado, I want to uh, introduce our first panelist, and we can start with their top. I have Dr. Rachel Elizabeth Harding will be presenting. Rachel Harding is a poet, a historian, a scholar of religions of African Atlantic diaspora. She teaches in the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of Colorado, Denver, and is the author of two books. Rachel, Dr. Harding is also a co-director of the Veterans of Hope Project. It's a community-based project, an initiative on religion, grassroots democracy, and healing, founded by her late parents. I want everyone to give a round of applause or snap for Dr. Harding.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you. Thank you, Natalia, for the invitation. And I'm glad to be with all of you today to talk a little bit about women in academia and particularly women of color. I am like probably many of us, thinking very much about the Asian American women and others who were murdered yesterday in Atlanta, and thinking about what um, that uh, phenomenon of anti-Asian violence means in the context of our society, particularly as we become more and more aware of our connectedness to each other across lines of gender and class and race, and the profound need to develop alternative ways of interacting with each other that do not center consciously or unconsciously white supremacy, which so often is linked to misogyny and to other forms of violence. So I'm going to just take my time today to tell you a little bit about um, who I am and kind of how I came into the context of academia, and within that narrative or that story, hopefully there are some, excuse me, some insights about women's leadership in general, but maybe in particular in terms of colleges, universities, educational institutions. And whatever I don't raise in my initial comments, if people have questions, I'm very happy to be in conversation after my colleagues speak. So as Natalia said, I teach in the ethnic studies department. My area of specific focus in my scholarship is Afro-Atlantic religions. So the religions that people of African descent developed in the Americas, in the Caribbean and North America and South America, as a result of our presence here because of the slave trade. And so in terms of looking at Afro-Atlantic religions, I look particularly at the role of resistance in those religions, the way in which the religious and spiritual traditions that people of African descent created help them um, cultivate and hold on to alternative understandings of who they were in the world. Because of course, in all of these societies of the Americas, Blackness and Black people were understood as existing in a very delimited space with very particular kinds of roles related to labor, related to subalternity, and in order to hold on to a sense of our own humanity, Black people had to constantly create and cultivate another understanding of who we are, who we were, and what in fact it means to be a human being. So with that kind of focus for my work, and I looked particularly at Afro-Brazilian religions and then African-American religiosity, some also at Haiti, Cuba, but particularly Brazil and the US. And so with that kind of focus, when I came to CU Denver in 2008, although I was very fortunate, I think, in many ways to be in a department, in the ethnic studies department, where a woman of color, Donna Martinez, who's Cherokee woman, was the chair, and where it was a relatively small department with a number of other women of color and a wonderful man of color, Dennis Green, who is a specialist in African American history there. There was something about that context that was very affirming to me as a woman of color coming into a space where I'm able to have colleagues who recognize the value of the work that I'm doing. But at the same time, I found in some ways the university as a whole not particularly dedicated, committed, um, 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 affirming of the importance of ethnic studies as a discipline and the resources for the department, even the lack of full status as a department for ethnic studies was something that concerned me. And so what I have found over my experience, both in graduate school and particularly now as a professor, is that I have had to find and make and cultivate networks of support outside of the academy in order for me to survive well in the academy. Um, and so in my case, um, people who are colleagues at other institutions of higher learning, have been important conversation partners and important people in my circle of friends. But just as important, in some instances, perhaps even more importantly, have been family members and women who are connected to these ritual communities that I study and participate in, who keep me in some ways connected to an identity beyond the university. Because, and I think that that's one of the values that women of color, particularly women of color who remain connected in some way to their communities of origin, that's one of the values that we bring to the university. In my own case, as I said, as someone who studies religions of the Afro-Atlantic diaspora, which in many ways are indigenous religions, there are maybe two kinds of theoretical approaches that inform my work particularly. One, and I don't know, whether people are familiar with these, but I'll just say a little bit about both of them. One is what's known as womanist approaches, or womanist epistemology, and the other is indigenous epistemologies. And epistemology just means ways of knowing, ways of understanding what it is that's in front of you, the world, the universe, ways of being in the world. And womanism is a term that comes from Alice Walker, who of course is a well-known writer, novelist, essayist, but who also created this a definition back in the early 80s as a way to kind of talk about Black feminism or women of color feminism and its particularities and distinctions from mainstream feminism, particularly around the idea of concern for the collective people, concern for women, but not solely for women and not for women outside of their relationships with other people in the community, whether that's children, elders, men. So there's an idea of womanism as a concern for the collective well-being of people, and also for recognizing that very often in communities of color, and certainly among women, whether that's in as scholars and in academia or in other professions, there is a deep tradition of um, the significance of religion and spirituality, and we bring that significance, we bring that tradition to everything that we do, including our activism, including our teaching, including our ways of being in the world. And so there are a number of people in a variety of disciplines, everything from education to architecture to medicine, sociology, but particularly in the study of religion and theology. There's a large group of womanist scholars who bring these perspectives grounded in the lived experience of Black women, and recognizing that intersectionality that Kimberly Crenshaw and others have helped us see, that connection of gender, of race, of class, but also of spirit, and also of recognizing our connectedness to others in our community, and working towards the well-being of the community as a whole. So that's been an important approach for me. And I needed to find that approach and incorporate it into my work so that I could feel that I could really make a place for myself in the academy. The other area that I'll just speak briefly about is the idea of indigenous epistemologies. And that is related to the way colonized people, indigenous peoples have understood who we are and what our relationship is to each other, to the natural world, and to the responsibility for helping to transform the society that we live in, the various societies that we live in, recognizing that these are traditions that come from ancestral roots, that have ancestral roots, and that speak to every aspect of how we live as human beings, from our relationship to the environment, to our ideas about what kind of society makes it easiest for us to be more human to each other. Because the policies that we enact, that the laws that are passed, the way that the economic systems that we embrace, all impact how we are to each other and how we are able to be more or less human, more or less humane to each other. And so one of the things that I appreciate about indigenous ways of understanding the world is the focus on the fact that we are all connected. All of us humans are connected to each other, and human beings are connected to every other living thing in the universe. And if that's the case, what does that mean for how we live our lives and how we treat each other and how we structure our societies? So those are kind of the two primary approaches, theoretical approaches that I use in my work. And as far as I'm concerned, they're very much centered around or very much aligned with resources that women bring, not always, but certainly can bring to leadership. Women have been, particularly women of color, have been very important mentors to me in my experience. I mentioned Donna Martinez. When I was in graduate school at UC Boulder, Evelyn Hugh DeHart, a Chinese American Chinese American Latin Americanist scholar. She's a scholar who studies Latin America, and her ethnicity is Chinese American. Was head of the of SARA, the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, like the Ethnic Studies Department up at CU Boulder. And she was a remarkable model of a departmental leader. And I saw some similarities when I came to UCD in Donna Martinez, and even my colleague Faye Coronan, who is also Asian American and is the current chair of the Ethnic Studies Department. What I have experienced in women administrators in terms of my personal relationships here at UC Denver and at UC Boulder is that there's often a focus around practicality, but also on what's best for everybody. I have seen, and again, I'm not speaking, for everyone. This is my experience. I've seen an emphasis on really trying to help colleagues navigate their way through the sometimes Byzantine character of of academia, but also at the same time, kind of keeping your eyes on the prize, helping people find practical solutions to their issues. Um, and so I guess the last thing that I would say, I just, in addition, which I kind of mentioned briefly earlier, in addition to the folks who in this UC University of Colorado system who have been mentors and good colleagues for me, um, nationally and internationally, again, uh, probably the people who have been most important to my sense of developing leadership and understanding what kind of teacher and mentor I want to be have been my mother and the women that I have studied and lived with in Afro-Brazilian religious communities. And these are by and large working class women who are centered around, whose concerns are very much womanist in the sense that um, they are people who often are the heart of their families and are the primary place of leadership and guidance and wisdom in their families, but that also then extends out into their communities, into the immediate communities, and into the larger communities of other people of African descent fighting for the human rights of Black people, of Indigenous people, and of poor people. And it has been very important for me to have those women as my models, as mentors, and as I organize my sense, as I said, of who I am as a scholar and who I am as a teacher, to have people outside of the academy, particularly Black women and brown women, who represent, I think, just magnificent models of what is possible and how to always remember um, that we need to be more human and more humane to each other and not less. So I'll just say that, and later if people have questions, I'm happy to be in more conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harding. I really enjoyed how you brought community into the development of each woman, how that is a necessity for us to strive and thrive, right? Um, I also like that you look at leadership from a different perspective than the traditional ways of looking at leadership. Um, a lot of people, if they're not a chancellor or the president of a university, they're not viewed as leadership. But in working with our students every day, working in the community every day, that makes you a leader in my eyes. So thank you very much for that insight. I really appreciate it. I'm going to bring the next person, and I'm sitting here like trying to read her thing, and I think it's yeah, I'm not going to read that. Dr. Dickerson is my mentor. I got my bachelor's degree from MSU, and Dr. Dickerson helped me with my senior thesis project. Um, she is an incredible woman, aspiring. And when I asked her to sit on the panel, she told me she wasn't really a leader, which I think is completely ridiculous, right? Dr. Harding has even pointed out that even if you're not in the traditional leadership role, that you're a leader. Um, I also noticed that she negated to put that she was the 2020 dissertation winner for Illinois. And her dissertation was amazing, amazing. So hopefully she will address that she's not being giving herself the props that she really deserves. She is the assistant professor over at MSU Denver in the English department, the only woman of color over in the English department at MSU, by the way. Um, so hopefully she'll address why her bio lacks all of these informations. Let's give it up for Dr. Sherika Dickerson.
Thanks, Natalia. So I'm glad you didn't read my bio and just gave me my props the way you wanted to give me props. It makes me feel honored. I'm totally honored to be asked to serve on this panel because initially when she asked me to serve, she's like, "This is on leadership." I'm like, "I'm not a leader," and she's like, "Yes, you are," and I'm like, "Well, I'm not officially a leader." And so she's like, "Well, you're a leader in your classroom," and I'm just like, oh, yeah, I am. So she made me think a lot about, what I understand as leadership, who counts as a leader, why we see these people counting as a leader, and why I am so hard pressed to give myself props. Somebody told me, not also Natalia, but other people are like, you need to like toot your own horn a little more. And I just always feel like I'm bragging. And so maybe I need to do that a little more. Um, but so Natalia said, she said, I already know what you're going to do. You're going to come in here and be like, I'm a Black woman. And yeah, I am. So, so one of the things, and Dr. Harding's talk just made me think about everything that I had already written down on my notes is probably going out the window because I do kind of want to piggyback on some of the things that she called attention to in her talk just a few minutes ago. But so where I often start is my positionality. Where do I see myself in this spectrum? As a scholar, I study narratives. More specifically, I study life narratives. And so my dissertation, since Natalia brought it up, was a combination of literary study and life writing. So what I did was I analyzed Ntozake Shange's seminal work for colored girls who have considered suicide even the rainbow is enough, and I analyzed it and called attention to the reality that that is kind of like a collective life narrative of Black womanhood. So a friend of mine allowed me to borrow her book when I was 14, and I read it in a couple hours. It was like, this is awesome. And I found myself coming back to that text time and again, all throughout my adult life, to the point where I feel like I have to teach it every couple years. It's on my syllabus this semester, just so I can revisit it and see kind of how my narrative is reflected differently in her poetry. So along with analyzing that, I also wrote little snippets of my own life narrative to coincide with themes that I found prevalent in Shange's work. And so this brought me to this place where I'm constantly looking at narratives that shape people's perceptions about me. So, as a Black woman, I am simultaneously invisible and visible, right? And hypervisible. I'm hypervisible as a Black woman because my presence as a Black woman precedes me. So when people see me, they're like, that's a Black woman. But they don't necessarily see Dr. Dickerson. They don't necessarily see Sherika. They don't see me. They see everything that they think they know about me as a Black woman. Well, Black women are angry. Black women are strong. Black women are loud. Black women are big, right? And so Dr. Harding called attention to this safe space that she found herself in when she came to the ethnic studies department at CU Denver, which is very unlike, which prompted me to write, well, then how do you reconcile being in this safe space that's like kind of the counter to everything else in academia that's really extremely hostile to your presence as a Black woman in an authoritative position, even if it's not technically a leadership position. As a professor, you're supposed to have authority over something, your courses, your classroom, anything. How do you reconcile being in this safe space when everything else in this space is hostile towards you because your presence as a Black woman precedes you? And so that is the thing that I am often grappling with in my classrooms, in the things that I teach, in the things that I write about. How does my presence as a Black woman shape what people expect from me, particularly when I'm in a leadership role? Does it put them in a position where they're like, this person is automatically incompetent and I'm going to have to teach her how to do what I expect she doesn't know how to do because she's a Black woman? And obviously she doesn't, right? Or am I going to have to butt heads with her because Black women are angry? These are the things that I grapple with all the time. And it puts me in this space where, am I free to be my authentic self? So if I'm in this safe space, like Dr. Harding is, then I feel like it's okay for me to bring my whole self, my authentic self, into the workplace, um, into my classroom. Um, or do I have to assimilate to standards where I have to tone it down, where I don't wear my hair so big, where I'm not so loud, where I don't use language that is native to the way that I speak? Do I have to do that all the time for people to take me seriously as a leader? Can I wear my chucks? Well, when Kamala Harris decided she was going to walk down the campaign trail in chucks, I said, you know what? I got about four pairs of chucks in my closet, and I wear it with a dress, and I don't care because this is my authentic self when I come into the classroom. We got to walk all around Aurelia campus, and I don't have time to be wearing cute shoes that's going to hurt my feet. But my chucks are comfortable. So I'm aware of those, right? And so it's just like, will people still take me seriously in a dress with chucks? Will they better? Right. And so this is kind of what I have to grapple with all the time is how do I then take those narratives that people already think they know about me and write a counter narrative that ends up being this narrative of resistance that simultaneously authorizes um, my ability to be present in this space as who I am. Right. So this is what I'm thinking about. So my dissertation is called, I can't tell you the name, it's so long, but it's like writing counter narratives is the short name, right? And so I see myself existing in this space as doing just that. I'm writing a counter narrative that says this woman and women like her is authorized to be in this space. And we should take them seriously because they know what they're talking about. I don't know if any of you guys have been under a rock for the past like year, but Black women have just been doing really major things and making waves and making all of these changes just because we need to persevere to survive, right? One thing that Dr. Harding talked about that really stood out to me was this idea of creating this community of women who can mentor her, who can advise her, who can support her. And they don't have to be in the academy. And so it makes me think about the reason why I moved back to Denver in the first place and sought out a position at Metro in the first place is because this is where my community is. My mom's here and she is like the leader of the family, right? She knows, she's my example. She's the person that I lean on. My sisters are here and they're all strong women. So why not surround myself with a community of people that are going to be there for me, that are going to support me? And the reason why I came into academia in the first place is because I wanted to be that person for a Black girl, a Black woman who enters my classroom and her whole body lights up when she walks in and sees that Black woman at the front of the room. When I think it was spring semester 2018 or 2019 or one of those semesters, there was a young Black woman, probably 18, 19 years old, and she said, I dropped my other class and signed up for yours because I looked at the profile and saw your picture there, and I just wanted to be in your class because you're a Black woman. And then when she wanted to write her research project, she said, I could write about Black women. I said, why not? I made a whole career about it, right? So validating that your experiences are valid for you is one of the things that I feel like is important to me as a leader in my classroom spaces, that oftentimes in academia, as Black women, as women of color, what we study does not validate our experiences. As Dr. Harding pointed out, we often find ourselves in this space where white supremacy and white patriarchy are central. And so, being a woman of color in that space, in this space, you decenter that focus on white patriarchy and white supremacy just by existing in that space. And so my presence in that space is just an act of resistance. And so I often call attention to, I think on that bio that Natalia didn't read, it says my teaching philosophy is that if you are comfortable, then you're not learning anything, right? Get uncomfortable. And so, what I like to do is make people uncomfortable, not just to kind of shock them, but for them to have to walk a moment in my shoes. Like existing in this space requires so many mental calculations before I even open my mouth that is automatically uncomfortable because it's not that safe space that's insulated from white supremacy and white patriarchy. And so when I teach, I said, we're going to get uncomfortable. We're going to be uncomfortable together, you know? And that's one of the philosophies that I live by when it comes to being a leader in my classroom. Because if you're uncomfortable, and Natalia, the class that I met Natalia in, we cried like the whole semester. So that class was super uncomfortable. That class was super uncomfortable. But I really feel like people took a lot away from it because we all got uncomfortable together. And so doing that is kind of like against the grain of what is expected in academic spaces, right? If it's uncomfortable, it's just because it's hard, but it's not uncomfortable because I'm making you think about your positionality, right? I teach a lot of courses centered around African American literature and women's literature. In that class that Natalia had me in was called Black Women Writers. And so we put both of them together, my favorite thing. And we talk about some uncomfortable stuff. Why? Because our lives are uncomfortable. And so a lot of people often take away a lot from that because they're like, wow, this was eye opening. This was groundbreaking. And I didn't feel like you were trying to jam it down my throat. Right. And the reason for that is because I often decenter my role as authority. Right. In academic spaces, it's very bureaucratic. It's very top down president, vice president, assistant vice president. There's an assistant vice president for everything, right? That's why there's so many leadership roles. And it's everything is top down, top down, top down administrative. So then when you come into my classroom, I don't like that top down approach because it doesn't work. You feel like it doesn't work to allow you to learn, to allow you to think in the way that you should, right? If I am the authority, it's like memorize what I say and regurgitate it for the paper, regurgitate it for the test. But if I decenter my authority and say, you know what, Natalia, what you have to say is extremely valid, say that and say that loud, right? And then somebody over here says something else and it might disagree with what she says. But let's talk about why these two people are in disagreement. And nobody ever said you had to pick a side. Maybe you just want to stay in the middle. And that's okay because it's okay to be in the middle, but not necessarily in the center, right? It doesn't have to be about me, right? So teaching a course called Black Women Writers, I'm not going to make the course about me because I'm not the only Black woman. I don't have the universal Black woman experience. I'm pretty sure Black women have had experiences similar to mine, but they're not absolutely the same. But it's important as Black women when they enter those classes to see somebody that not only reflects who they are in the front of the classroom, but to also read literature that reflects their experiences in the world. And so when I think about my role as a leader, the reason why I got into this in the first place is because somebody told me I couldn't do it. I told my advisor, I'm not gonna mention no names because I got my master's degree at CU Denver. Um, but I told my advisor in my master's program that I wanted to get a PhD, and she was like, "Well, they're kind of hard. Do you want to do that?" And I was like, "Absolutely." I was actually on the fence about it, but at that moment, I wanted to. Why? Because I felt like if there were more people like me in the front of the classroom, Black women like me, when they decide they want to go on to grad school, will have somebody championing them, championing, champion, championing, thank you, for them. right? So when Natalia said, I'm applying to grad school, can you write me a letter of recommendation? I'm like, when do you need it? Right? Because I need you as a strong leader yourself to pay it forward and to do the same thing that I've been doing for young Black women yourself, because that's what you do. She said she looks up to me and she sees me as a mentor. And it was so funny because in that class, Black women writers, we used to just butt heads all the time. And I'm just like, this woman do not like me at all. So then when she asked me to be her advisor for her thesis, I was like, that's odd. But but I just it was just, we're very much alike, but we didn't know that we were very much alike. And we actually play off of each other and we learn a lot from each other. And it's important to foster those relationships also inside of academia. So it's necessary to have that space outside of academia because you need to take that hat off, right? I was reading this thing the other day that said it's exhausting um, code switching as a person of color at work. And it's not just code switching with language, but code switching with your body language, with the way that you dress, with the way that you wear your hair, with the way that you speak, and the way that you approach situations. It's extremely exhausting. So it's important to have those safe spaces outside of the academy, but it's also important to have those safe spaces inside of the academy as well, so that um, you those people that are in that space with you are often contending with similar things, regardless of where they are. If they are in an administrative role, if they're in a faculty role, or even if they're in a student role, some of the things that we have to contend with as women of color are very similar. So I'm not gonna take up too much time because I could talk about anything all day. But the one thing that I do want to kind of leave you guys with in my talk is that, if you are, imposter syndrome is real, right? If you're a grad student and you're sitting here like, should I even be here? I don't even think I know what I'm talking about. I didn't understand what this chapter said. You belong there, because if you didn't belong there, you wouldn't be here in the first place. And so if you're a woman of color, a person of color, anybody who has ever been told that you don't belong in this space, if you find yourself in that space, you being in that space is an act of resistance. And so we need to resist this uh, idea that power has to be delineated from top down. We have to resist this white supremacist gaze. We have to resist this patriarchal gaze as women of color in these spaces, because just simply existing in that space in itself is an act of resistance. And to bring that back to my whole conversation about narrative, as you resist, you are writing a new narrative of who belongs in that space. So that's where I'm going to end today. And thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dickerson. I am surprised you ended this early.
I said I wasn't going. I told you I was going to cut myself off because we'd be here for the rest of the year. But but I want to give other people time to ask questions and other people to talk. So
Absolutely. I like that you stated the resistance because that is much needed. Often being in the classroom in predominantly white classrooms, we feel uncomfortable, and I think that they should feel uncomfortable with us. Um, that space should be opened up for us addressing issues of social justice, issues of racism, and that's not always done. So, you and Dr. Harding are inspirational in that sense of making that uncomfortable resistance alive and bringing our community together. So thank you for stating that. I don't want to make this all about me, but I am the coordinator of this event. So the women that I picked have had some type of influence on my community. And the next person I'm going to bring to the mic is very inspirational in my career and my career path. I am going to read your your bio because I didn't do that with Dr. Dickerson, but I wanted everyone to know that um, she's very inspirational to my career, and I thank her for this. Dr. Nelia Vivaros, more than 20 years experience in leadership and education, community organizing, and community development. She has prepared for supporting leaders and solving so that they're able to solve their own problems of equity and community building. Prior to joining higher education, Nelia advanced the causes of women's productive health and safety from violence, helping to fundraise and purchase a multi-million-dollar mobile health clinic serving immigrant women in downtown Toronto. Um, Dr. Vivaros currently uh, is serving as Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Operations and Interim Vice Chancellor for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. But her key roles that she's held at the University of Colorado and Schultz Medical, um, those are only two of the roles that she's held. In her normal course of work, she has re-envisioned and implemented entire offices of critical importance to the success and the development of Denver and Schultz campuses. Um, Dr. Vivaros, again, thank you for joining our panel, and I am going to let you have it.
Thanks, Natalia. Thank you, Dr. Dickerson and Dr. Harding, for setting the stage. Like it's this idea of like the woman of color network and community and the narrative and not being able to decenter your identity and your positionality in this space. I'm going to try to speak to that. And I think I'm just going to start it off. I'm going to start off with just a little bit about how I got into this and then a little bit about identity, because I mean, I obviously present differently and I wanted to own that privilege in this space. So as a scholar, I'm both a scholar and I guess I have the formal leadership title, although I totally still have imposter syndrome, even though I hold this associate vice chancellor title. Scholarly, in my scholarship pursuit, I studied trauma, violence, with particular focus on how that plays out in higher ed organizations on women of color, on BIPOC individuals in particular. More recently, I just did a study on the impacts of COVID in higher ed and how that was disproportionately impacting. We were seeing that early on into the COVID BIPOC individuals. I've also studied reproductive coercion. And for example, we looked pretty extensively at the CARES Act and we saw that what was happening, right, beyond supporting what was going on with the pandemic, we were actually intentionally with the legislation harming women of color by taking away necessary reproductive health services, such as defunding Planned Parenthood. So I do still have imposter syndrome, right? I'm a child of immigrants, Spanish, Portuguese, and Moroccan. That's kind of my background. I'm culturally poor, but by skin color, I'm actually quite privileged in this space. I was raised by a single parent who was disabled and illiterate. I dropped out of high school. I went to work for Planned Parenthood and then got really involved in women's reproductive health and access healthcare for immigrant women. And that's where actually I worked for the Immigrant Women's Health Center and spent years fundraising to get healthcare for women who didn't have other choices. That network is where it all started for me. I then found my way to a rape crisis center and I became a crisis counselor and did all this sort of work that really kind of, I hope, helped advance the cause. I went back to university actually as an older student. So I didn't ever think that I was one of those data points, right, that wasn't ever going to make it. And it was my community that supported me that said, you can do this. It's sort of like that sort of resistance, right? Higher ed really gave me the transformative experience. My community supported me through it. So I became involved with other women of color. Actually, one of them, Joanne Epps, who's now the provost at Temple University, she's a Black legal scholar, was probably one of my most important mentors and studied constitutional law. I fell in love with it. And then I went to law school myself, even though I was told that I would never make it. found my way through law school, fell in love of all things with Sharia law, and I wanted to practice Sharia law. That didn't happen. And right now, I've used a law degree in a different way. So for those of you that don't know, I recently just came off being the interim vice chancellor for diversity, equity, inclusion at the campus, and moving that cause in the campus following sort of, and this was on the heels of the deaths of George Floyd and many other people who died at the hands of police violence. My gift probably in this space as a leader, I mean, beyond sort of having the community that supported me, my gift in the field of diversity, equity, social justice is really about accountability, right? Because I'm building spaces, and that's where my resistance comes in, that responds to the cultural breaches that happen on campus. And when we hold people accountable beyond the advocacy roles that I think are wonderful and we need in this space, we also need, we know harms happen, we know cultural breaches happen, and that's where I come into this space to help prevent those and to mitigate harms as much as we can. That's a little bit about just how I got into this space. I want to talk a little bit about my identity because I think that might be a little bit more interesting and tie into what we've been talking about. So it's an inescapable truth. And when Natalia first asked me to be on this panel, I talked about that I'm going to bring my own passing whiteness and my own racism into anti-racist spaces, right? And I've actually written some notes to kind of guide me through this conversation. So, I know that I will reproduce racism in those spaces, and I own that. I can always work to do better. But part of doing better is accepting and sitting with this inherent kind of contradiction of my being in these spaces at all, right, as a white passing individual, trying to do anti-racist work while not denying the fact that I'm racist, and we all have that. So most people know me and know that I identify as Latinx. I'm a white passing Latinx woman. I'm cisgendered. I do have a disability. I identify as gay, but I pass as white. I own all of those. None of those identities are being brought up in any way other than to show you that despite all of them, I don't have the lived experience of having Black or brown skin, right? And I carry a lot of privilege simply because of my skin color. And here's where I kind of get a little bit political. I want to speak to the white Latinx community in particular when I talk about this, because I think that we need to decline the sort of get out of the whiteness card. So in the city I grew up in, for example, I was surrounded by a neighborhood with a large Latinx community, right? Many of which were Mexican and Puerto Rican immigrants. So I felt quite at home. I could sort of pass as white when I go into a bodega and ask for something. It's like, you don't look Spanish. Of course you answer in Spanish, or it's like, yeah, well, I am. In either case, I wanted to own that. I wanted to also own this sort of seemingly impossible kind of, for me, difficulty of both being Latinx and having this white appearance, right? And sort of how that identity plays out for me. So as this global repudiation, right, of white supremacy grows stronger, for me, I keep scratching my head, to be honest, at the sort of number of fair-skinned European-looking Latinx people I know, all of who have political tendencies and both in the US who refuse to be called white. So I sort of sit back and say, like, what's that all about, right? And I'm not intending to shame them. I'm not intending to call them out. I think what I'm coming to terms with is trying to understand why they understand their identity that way. And I mean, I want to understand why. I want to understand why, if you sort of carry this skin privilege, this color privilege, what it is about that you're repudiating in this space. So despite your life, right, of potential privilege because of that. And I obviously believe that in order to really kind of join the global movement against racism, against the work that we're all hopefully here to do, and for Black lives more specifically, Black and brown lives more specifically, it's absolutely critical for us as white Latinx individuals to start facing our own complicity with and participation in white supremacy. So the widespread refusal gets in the way, from my viewpoint, of our ability to do the anti-racist work we need to. So eventually, here's where I'm going to end. I'm not going to take the full 15 minutes, is we have to reckon with this idea of our entanglement with the histories of colonization, genocide, enslavement, and exploitation. Yes, being white and Latinx most probably means that some ancestor somewhere up our genealogical line, like Columbus, right, participate in some pretty heinous acts. And whether actively or passively, right, we have to own that. And yes, I recognize that people's genealogies are complex, but I also recognize that almost all of us can trace our genealogy to La Niña, La Pinta, La Santa Maria. So that's something we have to own as we present in this space. And we don't engage in things, and I know we have some questions I might talk about this, like white erasure of BIPOC voices, the idea of how to exist and how to be sort of more than performative allies in this space. I'm going to leave you with that. In terms of sort of how my identity plays into this. And I want to talk about just a little bit about leadership. So everything that was said, I mean, all I can do is really echo it. The idea of having a community of practice around you to support you along the lines of what Natalia was talking about, that's just key in this work. You know, the idea of sort of not decentering yourself and just being in the room and challenging that and knowing that you own that, no matter how you come into this space, is important. So if there's anything I want to pass on to you, it's that. And being willing to mentor people and take them under your arm and show them that they can do it. It was really, really important for me to have that in this space. Thank you, Natalia, for asking me. Thank you for allowing me that space to kind of check my privilege.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the vulnerability that you showed in your discussion today. It's difficult for us to kind of talk about our narratives out loud, kind of addressing our identities. And I was asked by a couple of students, like, why do you have that white lady on your panel? And
Yep.
I kind of chuckled to myself, like, so you're just assuming that she's
Yeah.
a white person. Um, but I think you using your white passing to help support our community of women of color, especially on campus, I think is profound. And I thank you for being part of my community. Um, uh, Aja is part of my community as well, and I have learned a lot from my undergraduate coworker. She's going to start us off with our conversations and our discussion and our questions. If you have questions, please drop them into the chat, or you can raise your hand, and we will try to make sure we get to every question that folks have. So, Asha, I believe you have a question already.
Yes, I do. I want to say first that I resonated with so much that was shared. This was a really powerful, you know, learning experience for me, but also it felt very validating to hear the things that I felt expressed. Um, so, moving beyond that, my first question is can you speak to a time where you had to, disregard the WASP identity or the majority opinion to do what was right in order to advocate for others within your space who didn't carry the same privileges that academia has provided you with?
I think Dr. Vivaros is frozen a little bit. So, if Dr. Harding and Dr. Dickerson want to start off with that question.
Yes, I'd be glad to respond. And I'm trying to think of specific examples. In some ways, Aja, I think, excuse me, the fact that the kinds of courses that I teach African American history, I teach Indigenous studies, I teach African American literature. I'm teaching an African diaspora course, women of color. Almost everything, introduction to ethnic studies, almost everything that I teach in some ways clashes with mainstream ideology. And so maybe, I hope this isn't, well, I'll just answer. Maybe the way, the most direct way I can think of to answer your question is that I hope, in some ways, like my colleague Dr. Dickerson was saying, just my presence and the fact that the class and the way that I teach the class requires students to address issues that they may not be looking at in any of their other classes, and for some of them, not even in outside of school. Of course, many students of color do have to are impacted by issues of injustice and issues of, um, of of identity outside of the classroom. But for many of my white students, this is a place where, for some of them, they have been curious, they've been interested, they're aware that they don't know things that they need to know, and so they're in the class. So if anything, I think, or I hope, that I'm modeling a way to speak to and embrace the fullness of our history as a nation, and encouraging all of my students to recognize that this is all of our history. African American history is Latinx history. Asian American history is women's history. Gay and lesbian history is American history. I mean, so I think, I hope that just the way that I present and teach and model breaks some of the barriers, and is a way of standing up for students and communities who are not always heard in the academic setting. I don't know if that's exactly what you were asking, but that's what came to my mind.
Okay. I would just like to say, Dr. Harding, that was extremely powerful. And I like co-sign everything that you say. I'm not even sure if I'm going to answer this question, but what Dr. Harding was saying made me think about the day after the presidential election in 2016, where um, we all remember that day, right? And so I was supposed to teach my first year writing courses that morning at 9:30 and 11 o'clock. And I'm just like, how am I going to walk into this classroom and go in there and start talking about writing an annotated bibliography when I don't want to do that, you know? And so, like, Metro is a Hispanic serving institution. And where I see most of my Latinx students is in those first year writing classes. So both of my first year writing classes at 9:30 and 11 were at least 50% Latinx students. Okay. And we know one of the platforms that 45 ran his campaign on, Build the Wall, right? And so I get there and everybody is like halfway in tears, including myself, um, because of the implications of this. And so yeah, I said, you know what, guys? We're not going to talk about annotated bibliographies this morning. Let's just sit down and have real talk, and let's talk about what this means, what this is a representative of, how this is the country that we've been in. Everybody's been denying the racism. Everybody's been denying the sexism. Everybody's been denying white supremacy and white male patriarchy. But yet here we are. Let's talk about this and how this impacts us as individuals, how this impacts us collectively. Because let me tell y'all something, y'all gonna walk into calculus and your calculus professor's gonna go put some differential equations up on the board and not even blink twice about what happened. So if y'all want to have this is a safe space. Okay. Okay. And this is a safe space for us to have this conversation so that we can process this together. And it was quiet for a moment, and then people started talking. And then I had about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, a whole bunch of students emailed me later that day. Many of them Latinx students. And one student said, I didn't even want to come to school today. She said, but I came to school this morning because I knew you, out of all of my professors, was going to be the only one to say something about it. And she said, and you were absolutely right, because you were the only one that said anything about it. She said, I was in tears. She had on big sunglasses. I was in tears and I didn't want to come. She said, but I came because I knew you would validate my experience for me. right? And so I feel like it's important to use that opportunity to create a safe space within yourself. Because I've always been leery of people that put the little safe space decals on their offices. Because I'm like, is this really a safe space, or are you just doing that because it's trendy? But model that behavior and bring that into the classroom with you, because that is an act of resistance by doing that. So it validated for me that that was the right decision to make. Even though they're annotated, I had to push their annotated bibliographies back like a week because we didn't talk about it. But that's okay, because what mattered at the moment was that self care that was necessary for me and my students and my 20, however many students that were in that classroom that day needed that space to process this information in a way that was validated. And so I think that kind of speaks to, I don't even remember what the question was, but I think that kind of speaks to what you were saying.
No, it absolutely does. And yes, having that validating experience was so critical for me to be able to navigate my identity as a person of mixed heritage. The imposter syndrome that comes with being multi-heritage and trying to navigate these white institutions and having that toxic gatekeeping from your own communities too. Having those validating conversations with other people who identify like me was so critical for me being okay with who I am now. And I didn't start having those conversations in depth until I came to the university and I started interacting with other BIPOC people who had similar experiences, who had similar challenges, who were able to explain and kind of break down the processes for me in a way that was digestible, that I had not received in the classroom, that I had not received from my peers. So yes, absolutely. Sorry, Dr. Viveros, if you wanted to contribute.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'll just go back to this idea of like, because I live and breathe in the leadership space, I have the formal, hope I don't get cut off from you. I have this formal title that kind of gives me a gateway into those patriarchal spaces. So what are some of the things we've done, like holding people accountable by, and this is along the lines of what Dr. Ibrahim Kindi's been talking about for a while, right? Racist policies recreate racist practices. So challenging policies, things like taking binary language out of policies, which is a work that came directly out of our office. Looking at things like racial impact statements for policies, because we know these policies unduly harm. Questioning in leadership meetings how we're going to address cultural breaches, for example. Like it's again, we're doing the work, we're doing that, but if we don't have systems that hold people accountable, and if they can continue to create these harms and microaggressions can continue to occur, and we're not doing anything about them, then we're being performative, right? It's the idea of moving beyond statements and holding people accountable for their words, actions, and deeds, and setting the stage, right? Along the lines of what we did when we took over the DI spaces, like we can make a stand. Like we are an institution that can have a heart and that can take a stand against. And this is along the lines of what Chancellor Frank said shortly after Charlottesville, like a Nazi is a Nazi is a Nazi, and a racist is a racist is a racist. And we can say that without sort of tripping over ourselves and saying, well, guidelines in the classroom. So those kinds of conversations and that issue of accountability is how I enter into the space. And that's, I think, what I bring to this work most effectively is that through work that's going on already.
Awesome. That is amazing. I'm moved. Uh, we have a participant that has a question. Pamela?
Hi, everyone. I'm really enjoying the conversation and in every way. And I'm not unfamiliar with this conversation because my office is next to Sherika's, and we have a lot of conversations. But here I am, a white person, middle aged, cisgender, and I just wanted to comment, and for all of you, how much I appreciate a different aspect of leadership that you present. So let's say with my example with Sherika is always, first of all, she's very much involved with contemporary literature. I'm a medievalist, but I've just finished a book on global medieval history from 500 to 1500 with 3 co-authors, trying all the way to decenter Europe. Well, as I decenter Europe, of course, I decenter myself. And what all of you are doing is, one of the ways that you provide leadership, Sherika certainly does to me all the time, is now as I'm the outsider, I mean, it's still a woman, but as I'm an outsider, decentering the culture that has always provided so much privilege for me, I'm looking for those ways back in. How do I get back into what is now the center of the conversation when the conversation has wonderfully, magically, perfectly shifted away? And I have to expect that, let's say, Sherika, for instance, will offer a hand to me and, allow me to be part of the conversation and allow me to stumble around. I mean, first of all, with my medieval stuff, which is already not Sherika's area for sure, but also just in general, needing a way back in. Luckily for Sherika and I mean, in addition to I just so respect her and we're friends. We both went to Denver public high schools. So I went to South High, she went to East High. We're from the same neighborhood. We have the same geography of our childhood and so many things in common that way. But I remember being in 6th grade when busing started and what that was like in a public school system in the middle of the country, not on the coasts. And my children went to another public high school in Denver, George Washington High School, which is quite a diverse place. And um, we have some basics to talk about, right? Also, her mother makes really amazing macaroni and cheese at her restaurant. But other than that, I am in the position now of recognizing how much I need a hand in. And I need to have my statements corrected, or I need to be guided to other thinking. And I appreciate that leadership that Sherika offers me. As I'm senior faculty, she's junior faculty, and I look to Sherika all the time to ask the questions I need to try to remain to adjust to the role of being decentered. Does any of that make sense? I think about it all the time, but I'm never quite sure what the words are. It just felt again like a safe space to say that and out loud. Thanks, Sherika.
If you want to address the censoring, Dr. Dickerson.
Um, what did you say, Natalia? Sorry.
Can you address the censoring for
Oh, okay.
your colleague?
Yeah. Oh, well, yes, definitely. Thanks, Pam. Pam and I are an odd couple. Our offices are like 2 doors down from each other, but uh, we keep each other kind of grounded. One thing I can say about Pam is as she recognizes her need to decenter herself, she doesn't try to kind of double back and put herself back in the center. So when she needs something that she's not um, up on, she's not going to try to do it herself. And like Nelia was talking about with the white erasure of BIPOC voices, what she does then is she'll say, can you guest lecture my course so that I can center your expertise, your voice in this thing that I'm probably gonna jack up anyway.
I don't know if I
um,
jack it up.
but yeah, but so that it's like there are other people that are qualified to talk about this, and I'm not the most qualified, and I'm not going to pretend to be the most qualified. And so I respect that attitude that she takes on that, because I think this is why BIPOC voices often get erased, is because people don't want to defer to the experts and say, let me take a step back on something that I'm really not an expert on, and privilege the voices of those who are experts, who that is their lived experience, and is not an outsider looking in. So it's not necessary for me to center myself and then or say I'm going to decenter myself, but then double back and recenter myself. And so I think that's one of the things that we that I think Pam does a really good example of, is kind of actually accepting the marginal space, so that her voice isn't the one that's privileged. And I think that's one of the things that we need to, I think, kind of champion a little bit more in academia, because there's a lot of academic grandstanding that goes on in faculty roles, where people are like, well, I read how to be anti-racist, so now I know how to be an anti-racist. And it's like, yeah, no, you don't. No, you don't, right? And so you'll use that you read this book to kind of dismiss my lived experience, because you feel like your voice should be privileged, your voice should be centered. And it's just like, okay, you read the book, and now what do we learn from this? How can we take this forward? What can we learn more, or what else can we read that will put together the actions that you need to make to actually become an anti-racist? So that's one thing I will say about my good friend Pam, is that she knows how to take that sidestep where it's necessary. And I encourage her to encourage our other colleagues to do similar things.
Thank you so much for that.
Well,
And
if I can offer up a little bit, if that's okay.
yes,
So Pam, my internet connection's always, I actually get asked this question.
Oh, shoot. She's faded
A
out.
lot, just my role in DEI. Here's some advice that I've just passed on. Can you hear me now?
Sort of, yes.
Am I back now? Okay, well, let's try this. So I don't think there's a perfect, I mean, just along with Dr. Dickens in terms of like the role as an ally in this space. But we do have a responsibility to keep trying to show, keep trying to show up, right? And it's helpful to the movement to step back when it's not as well, which I think is what I've passed on in my own kind of training. White activists in this space can improve by policing one another. We talked about this question of how like I can help in my leadership policing sort of around concerns related to credit and spotlight grabbing behaviors, right, that sort of steal the voice of BIPOC people in the space. So activists of color don't have to expend the energy to do that. We can also correct ourselves and each other when we start to subtly usurp, right, the control of BIPOC-led organizations. And this is like along the lines of what Malcolm X was talking about, right? It's our default, right, to do that. Checking ego and prioritizing movement goals. Or something else we talk about a lot in this space, of the need for recognition and validation, right? We sort of checking that privilege. And then in addition to giving full credit to BIPOC sort of voices, and this goes again back to this idea of white erasure and sort of centering or decentering yourself in this space, is we also need to take responsibility for this sort of this idea of white owned, white originated mistakes, harms, and damage that we've created in this space. So just some of the stuff. So I think along what Dr. Dickerson was saying, what you're doing is knowing when to step back, knowing when to be there, and knowing that living on the margins is okay. And asking questions when you need to is exactly kind of what we're sort of talking about in this space. So thank you for doing that. It's something I try to do. It's hard as hell, right? Because privilege is hard.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments.
awesome. Thank you for the wonderful statement question, Pamela. I have a question. I want to know how your own lived experiences are infused into your work.
I'll go. Because I study life writing, it's real easy. I just write about my life. So one of the things that I like to do, especially as thinking about scholarship, is try to find unique ways to insert my narrative. And not saying that I have to be the focus, but insert my narrative into these conversations, because a lot of times people don't see anecdotal evidence or narrative evidence as evidence, right? We need numbers, we need statistics, we need some kind of chart that I can, quantify this or replicate this experiment for it to be valid. And and I do want to call attention back to Dr. Harding calling upon Alice Walker and her womanism, and thinking about the way that womanism and Black feminism says that there are different ways of knowing, that there are different ways of teaching, that there are different ways of leading, and we need to privilege all of those, right? And so if my way of knowing is through storytelling, and namely telling my story, then I can teach through telling my story. Anybody who's ever had me in class knows that I randomly tell stories of my son. Y'all just saw him. Um, just random. I'm like, oh, let me tell you what my son said. Totally not related to anything, but it was funny, right? Okay, now you're paying attention to me. So let's talk about the real stuff. And so I feel like storytelling, and some of the best orators are storytellers, right? So if you tell a story, you're going to engage people, and then they're going to listen to you, and they're going to believe you because you've established that pathos, that emotional connection to them by telling stories. And so any opportunity that I have to tell my story, I'm going to tell it, because historically Black women's voices have been silenced, they've been erased, they've been dismissed. And so as somebody who's kind of championing the role of Black women as a leader, I'm going to tell my story wherever possible.
Great, wonderful. Let me add a little bit in that same vein that Dr. Dickerson was speaking about. Again, I think that my path in academia has been a little perhaps different than some others, but at one point, and I think it may have been, yeah, it was, I have 2 graduate degrees. I have an MFA in poetry and a PhD in history. And when I was doing the MFA, I started studying Afro-Brazilian history. And it was actually some of that history and the history of the way that Black people in Brazil used religion to help, as I was saying before, hold on to their humanity in a very traumatic circumstance. I wanted to learn how to share those stories, and I wanted to do that through poetry. But then once I started studying the history, I wanted to know more of the history. And so ultimately what happened for me was that I was able to find a discipline, this study of Afro-Atlantic religions, the history of Afro-Atlantic religions and their relationship to resistance and their role as a resource to navigate and transform trauma. I began, even though I started that as a historical study, looking at the colonial period in Latin America, 18th and 19th century, I began seeing contemporary examples and contemporary uses. So, and that was very exciting for me to see how there is this tradition of people of African descent, but also other people who have experienced colonization, and other people who have been kind of on the underside of modernity, right? People who have been the subaltern, people who have been the oppressed, have often used religion, spirituality, culture as resources for transforming the world, for transforming their personal experiences, but also for fundamentally changing, or at least significantly, profoundly challenging the societies that they've lived in. And so the piece of advice that I would give to anybody who loves studying and learning and is considering, graduate work and perhaps a life in the academy, find something that you love, find something that you're passionate about, and then make that the subject of your study, and don't be afraid or hesitant to bring the insights of your personal experience, as Dr. Sherika was saying, to your study. Excuse me. There'll be lots of other approaches that you will pay attention to, and that you will give attention to, and that you'll engage with. But Bernice Johnson Reagan, who is a scholar of African American religious music. She worked at the Smithsonian for many years. She was, for those of you who know a little bit about civil rights history, she was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and part of their singing group, the SNCC Freedom Singers. And it's interesting because I think as an artist, as a musician, this metaphor, and maybe for her it wasn't even a metaphor, it was an actual thing, but this example had particular resonance. As a musician, she talked about running sound through your body and trusting what your body tells you about what that sound means. And just again, parenthetically, what she was talking about was how, in the context of the Southern Freedom Movement, the Civil Rights Movement, people use these songs, ancestral, the spirituals, the songs that enslaved people had created to help them survive the traumas of slavery, that were then transformed into freedom songs. The words were changed, but there are some powerful sounds in African American religious music, particularly in those old, drawn out, lined hymns, that they almost have a sound like there's a Buddhist tradition of singing where one voice makes a kind of two sounds. It's a drone. It's just this powerful, resonant sound. And she was talking about how she learned to make that sound. She learned to use music to transform space and to transform the people who were singing it, so that they become filled with enough courage to face the dogs and the fire hoses and the impediments to their freedom. And so she said that what she learned to do in that experience was to run sound through her body as a way of navigating spaces. And I think about it in terms of my own research, is running certain experiences through my body, in addition to my archival research, in addition to my work in primary and secondary sources, to trust my experience and the experience that I learned from living in communities of people of color, people of African descent in Brazil and in the United States, to trust that there is a wisdom in the collective experience that I can access, along with the documentation, along with the archival material, and to understand that that's part of the insight that I bring, and that's part of the richness, that as an African American woman scholar, that I can bring to this work. So I think I'm going a little bit off on a tangent, but my point is, find something that thrills you. Find something that you love, that you're curious about, that you're interested in, that connects you to your desire to help make this society and this world a better place. And that will carry you a long way. Because as as we've said, and as my colleagues have said, academia is often not an easy or a welcoming place for people of color. But if you can find something, hook your star to something that just gives you joy, and then you can make your way, and find some good people to do it with. You can make your way. Mhm.
Dr. Viveras.
I'm not sure I have much. I didn't remember the question.
How does your
What was the
live
question again, Natalia?
how does your lived experience impact your work? How is it fused into your work?
Um, oh my gosh. I think identity, race, or otherwise is your lived experience. I'm not sure how you extrapolate one from the other. I mean, I just don't. I don't know how many of you were at the recent social justice teaching we did, where we talked about, we were focusing on Black joy. We ran a video of Toni Morrison talking to Charlie Rose about removing your identity from your work. Like, it's impossible. Like, would you ask that? Would you ask that of anybody else, of any white thing? Like, why are you centering whiteness in it? Just, it's impossible. Your lived experience is who you are. And I echo everything that was said with Dr. Harding and Dr. Dickerson in terms of like finding your joy and your passion. And that'll get you through the patriarchal battles. It'll get you through the inevitable stops and starts you're going to have, that, and finding your community to support you along the way. I'll end with that.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any other questions that they would like to ask of our panelists?
If no one does, then I'm going to use this opportunity to ask a question.
Absolutely.
Alrighty then, I'm just gonna take the floor. So my question is, what are some characteristics that define a leader who is conscious of others' identities and lived experiences without tokenizing them or making them perform their pain in order to better the system? I'm sorry, that's a really hard question, but I just wanted to get your input.
Aja, that's a hard question for real. But I wrote down in my talking points that I had a whole bunch that I never got to. And one of the things was, what is a leader to me? And a leader, the characteristics that a leader would possess is just basically being that role model, that mentor, that advisor. If you, and I'd have to put a caveat in there, is that they have to be empathetic. They have to have empathy. They have to know how to read people and how to cater their leadership style to different people, because different people work differently, they think differently, they act differently, they respond differently to different stimuli. And so a good leader is all of those things. They're a role model, they're a mentor, they're an advisor. They can advise you in the way that you need to be advised. There's no cookie cutter advising that is presented. There's no cookie cutter mentorship, because what Natalia needs is going to be different than what Rachel needs, than what Milia needs, than what Pam needs, than what Aja needs. All of these people are different. And one thing that I have a bachelor's degree in business management. It's just like, how you end up with a PhD in literature. It's just like, yeah, 18-year-olds don't really know what they want to do. Um, and I'm a poster child for that. So, but one thing that I did take away from business school when I was there is that a good leader knows how to, and not saying that you have to cater specifically to other people, but if you want people to follow you and follow your example, then you need to lead by example. But you also have to treat people equitably and cater to their style, because what works for you, your style is what works best for you. And as you're mentoring these people, you have to shape that mentorship around what works best for them. So I would just say empathy, mentorship, and being a good advisor.
I'll go if Dr. Harding doesn't want to go.
Well, Okay, I'll say something just very, very briefly. I agree with everything that Dr. Dickerson said. And the only addition that I would make is that I've been thinking about those qualities that she was talking about, all of it, the particularly the sensitivity to have, developing a sensibility that gives you a sensitivity to the individual needs of each person, um, as well as the other things that she mentioned. In my mind, that conjunction of that style of leadership is mothering. And I would encourage us to think about mothering as a leadership style and as something that we, as women of color, as femmes, or even just as people who appreciate the wisdom and the insights of women, that we claim that with pride and with a recognition of the value and the wisdom and the, the sensitivity and clarity that is necessary to mother well, that mothering is a form of leadership that I think describes well what Dr. Dickerson was talking about.
So I actually ended up doing my dissertation. I did study trauma, but I studied leadership through the lens of sort of gender. And I looked at sort of how change and trauma kind of are built together. What I learned actually was really interesting, particularly in higher ed, because I was focusing on higher ed. So there's really no such thing as leadership. Like, you're not born with it. It doesn't come naturally. It's not genetically imprinted in all of us. And that's actually the type of leadership we study as a behavioral is actually a white patriarchal construct, right? Because white, able, cisgendered men are the ones that sort of tend to kind of fill into those roles. So I actually looked at it and I said, rather than calling it leadership, it's probably better for us to look at it kind of as leadership practice. And that ties into Dr. Harding's concept of like different styles, mothering, the idea of sort of what Dr. Dickerson was talking about, meeting people where they're at and being an adaptive leader. Because as in that leadership role, whether you have a formal title or not, right, you're kind of adapting. You're adapting to the context. You're adapting to the situation. You might have goals, work foci, proximal goals, distal goals, all those things that come into like how you lead in a space. So it's your leadership practice that's we're constantly refining, and it's the tools that events like this give us. Aja, getting back to it, so you're just going to have a lifetime of building, putting tools into that toolbox as a leader to sort of refine your practice over and over again. And you're going to do that with your community of practice. You're going to do that with people around you. You're going to do that through events like this. But I want to talk, just as I talk about that, just because I have a positional title and I have like a formal leadership title, I want to get back to, I think it's something Natalia said about spheres of influence. This idea that we don't honor enough people, and I think it was Dr. Dickerson was saying, I'm not a leader, we all are. We are absolutely all leaders in this space, and we need to start honoring those spaces that we all take up, whether we have the titles or not, and say, this is where I belong, and this is how I'm making an impact and a difference, right? And this is how I'm influencing my followers to whatever that end is, and meeting them where they're at. So keep building your toolbox and keep working at it, Aja. You're doing great.
Thank you so much. I want to give all of our panelists a round of applause and thank them for being here with us. The three of you are inspirational leaders, and we are lucky to have you on our campuses, in our environment as part of our community. If you have any additional questions that weren't answered today, please send them to cii@ucdenver.edu. Haha, I forgot that part, but yeah, edu. And we will definitely filter them to Dr. Dickerson, Dr. Vivaros, and Dr. Harding. We want to thank you again for attending. I will get the quiz winner their e-gift card to Amazon and be looking for future events hosted by CII. Thank you so much for attending.
Bye. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Bye, Sherka.
Bye, Pam.
See you later.
Thanks for coming, Jim.
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Jim. Jim, you're on mute.
You didn't confess that you are an official leader in the English department. You are the chair of the literature faculty, and one of your responsibilities, you have stepped up and taken the responsibility to lead 8 or 9 very different, I don't want to say